Before we begin, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's the hidden truth behind one of America's most violent rivalries, a story written in blood, loyalty, and betrayal inside the walls of U.S. prisons. Every episode reveals another secret, another scar, another truth the system tried to bury. Join our community, share your thoughts below, and help us keep uncovering the stories no one else dares to tell. The story begins in the dusty corridors and iron gates of California's prison system during the 1960s, a time when the walls echoed not only with the sounds of clanging cell doors, but also with deep racial divides and the beginnings of organized power among inmates. Within those confined spaces, a new kind of hierarchy was forming, one built not on the laws of the state, but on codes of loyalty, survival, and vengeance. The Mexican mafia, known simply as La Ime, had already established itself as a ruthless force. Their influence ran deep across the prisons of Southern California. To many inmates, they were untouchable, controlling drug routes, enforcing discipline, and punishing betrayal with death. But in the northern parts of the state, a different story was taking shape, one born out of resentment and rebellion against that same power. It all began at Soledad Prison, one of the most notorious facilities in California. There, a group of Latino inmates, mostly farm workers' sons from the agricultural heartland of Northern California, grew tired of being treated as inferiors by the Southern California gangs who dominated the system. These men, often called norteños for their northern origins, faced humiliation and exploitation not only from the prison guards, but also from their fellow Mexican-American inmates who followed La Ime's rule. Out of this frustration emerged an idea that would forever change the balance of power, to create a new brotherhood, one that would defend the dignity of northern inmates against the oppressive structure controlled by the South. In 1968, amid growing racial tension and violent riots inside California's prisons, this brotherhood took shape under a name that would soon echo across every cell block: Nuestra Familia, meaning our family. It was more than a gang. It was a statement of identity, a rejection of submission, and a declaration of war against both external oppression and Southern dominance. Their founding members, often older and more disciplined than typical inmates, created a strict hierarchy based on military structure. Every member took an oath of loyalty that could never be broken, under penalty of death. They trained in secrecy, communicating through coded messages and shared philosophies centered on unity, respect, and self-defense. In their eyes, Nuestra Familia was a resistance movement within the walls. La Ime, however, saw it differently. To them, Nuestra Familia was nothing but an act of betrayal, a splinter faction daring to challenge the authority they had built through blood. The Mexican mafia's response was immediate and merciless. The prisons of California turned into battlegrounds. Folsom, San Quentin, Soledad all became stages for an invisible war fought in the shadows. The spark that ignited one of the most violent feuds in U.S. prison history came when a La Ime member stole a pair of shoes from a Nuestra Familia affiliate during a baseball game inside Soledad. What followed was chaos. Knives made from sharpened metal pieces, blood on the concrete, and a clear message. This was no longer about stolen property, it was about power. As the 1970s arrived, the divide between North and South became absolute. Nuestra Familia recruited heavily from Northern California inmates, farm towns like Salinas, Fresno, and Stockton, while La Ime and their loyalists came to be known as Sureños, or Southerners. What began as a geographical distinction evolved into a full-scale identity war. Sureños adopted the number 13, representing the letter M for La Ime, while Nuestra Familia and their allies took the number 14, symbolizing N for Norte. Tattoos, colors, and even language became symbols of allegiance. Red bandanas and the number 14 marked the Northerners. Blue and the number 13, the Southerners. Inmates could no longer walk through certain yards without revealing where their loyalty stood. Choosing wrong meant death. Behind these symbols, however, lay something more complex, a story of identity and class within the Mexican-American community itself. Many of the northern inmates came from poor, rural agricultural regions, working in the fields and enduring exploitation both outside and inside prison walls. In contrast, many southern inmates identified with urban life, Los Angeles barrios, street culture, and the power of La M. Nuestra Familia positioned itself as the voice of the oppressed, of the farm workers, the forgotten, the ones who spoke Spanglish and wore work boots instead of slick shoes. It was this narrative that gave them legitimacy among northern inmates and turned them into a powerful social movement within prison walls, but ideals alone couldn't sustain them. As the years passed, both groups became entangled in the same web of drugs, weapons, and revenge that had once fueled their enemies. The initial mission of unity and self-protection slowly evolved into organized crime operations, both inside and outside of prison. Nuestra Familia's command structure began to resemble that of a paramilitary organization, with generals, lieutenants, and soldiers. Orders were transmitted through secret notes, kites, and murders were sanctioned through coded language that only members could understand. Their power spread beyond the bars, reaching neighborhoods in Northern California from San Jose to Sacramento. At the same time, the Sureños, under the guidance of La M, expanded across the southern states, forming alliances with street gangs and controlling drug routes that reached into Mexico. By the early 1980s, the California Department of Corrections was forced to acknowledge that prisons had become incubators for organized crime. Segregation policies were introduced to separate norteños and sureños, but even isolation couldn't stop the hatred from spreading. The division had become cultural, almost generational. Young inmates arriving in prison were automatically pulled into one side of the war based on where they came from. There was no neutrality. Inside the walls, being unaffiliated was a death sentence. You either belonged to the family or to the South. As violence intensified, Nuestra Familia's ideology hardened. Their internal rules demanded absolute loyalty, betrayal, even a whisper of cooperation with authorities meant execution. Some of their founding leaders, like Robert Grattan and Henry Cervantes, envisioned a revolutionary structure, but over time, power corrupted the cause. Money from extortion, drugs, and contract killings transformed Nuestra Familia into one of the most dangerous prison gangs in the United States. Still, their members justified every act with the same phrase that echoed from cell to cell: La causa sigue, the cause continues. This was the beginning of an era, an age where California's prisons became the stage for an invisible war, fought in shadows, whispered through cell bars, written in blood. Nuestra Familia had risen not just as a gang, but as a symbol of rebellion against oppression. Yet, in creating their own empire of order, they also birthed their own cycle of violence. And on the other side of that line, the Sureños, born from loyalty to La M, prepared to answer that challenge with equal force. What started in the dusty yards of Soledad would soon turn every major prison into a battlefield, where survival was not just about strength, but about allegiance. The battle for identity, control, and legacy had only begun. Inside the prison walls, power alone was never enough. Survival depended on loyalty, order, and the belief that every man was part of something greater than himself. For Nuestra Familia and the Sureños, this was not just a war of territory or blood. It was a war of ideology. It was about defining who they were, where they came from, and what they stood for in a system designed to strip them of all identity. The rules were invisible, but everyone knew them. They were carved into flesh with tattoos, whispered in coded prayers, and carried like scripture through generations of inmates. For Nuestra Familia, the code began with unity. Their members referred to each other as carnales, brothers, bound not by blood, but by the sacred oath of la causa, the cause. The cause was everything: loyalty, honor, respect, and above all, sacrifice. A man could lose his life, but never his word. The rules were strict: no disrespect toward a fellow brother, no cooperation with authorities, no drug use that compromised the mission, and no hesitation in carrying out the orders of the higher ranks. Breaking these codes was not just betrayal, it was treason punished by death. The structure of Nuestra Familia mirrored that of a military regime. At the top sat the generals, those who dictated orders from the highest security facilities, often through coded letters disguised as family correspondence. Beneath them were lieutenants, captains, and soldiers, each assigned with maintaining discipline and control within their designated territories. Even the recruitment process resembled a rite of passage. Prospects were watched for months, sometimes years, before being fully accepted into the brotherhood. They had to prove unwavering loyalty, often through violent acts that tested both courage and obedience. But Nuestra Familia was not built on violence alone. They viewed themselves as protectors, a revolutionary force standing against oppression, racism, and the dominance of southern gangs led by La M. Their members often spoke of education, requiring recruits to study the history of Chicano struggles, Aztec heritage, and prison politics. They saw their war as part of something larger, a fight for respect and representation in a society that had long silenced them. Inside the darkness of prison life, this ideology gave them purpose, almost a religion of their own making. Across the state, the Sureños, loyal to the Mexican mafia, lived by a different creed. Their code was older, rooted in absolute power and submission to La M. Blood in, blood out. Once you joined, the only way to leave was through death. They followed the number 13, representing the letter M, and considered themselves soldiers of the South, sworn to defend the legacy of La M. Unlike Nuestra Familia, who emphasized organization and hierarchy, the Sureños operated with fluid authority, driven by fear and respect for their leaders. Their rule was simple: loyalty to La M above all else. Orders came from the top, and questioning them was unthinkable. Colors became sacred symbols in this ideological war. Red belonged to the north, blue belonged to the south. Inside prison yards, these colors were more than decoration. They were declarations of life or death. A red bandana could save you among your own, or get you killed if you wore it in the wrong cell block. Even numbers became identifiers: 14 for the north, 13 for the south. The walls of California's prisons turned into a coded battlefield, where graffiti, tattoos, and letters spelled allegiance in ways that only insiders could read. The tattoos told stories: the sombrero with a machete and the words Nuestra Familia inked on a chest, the number 13 with the black hand of La M on an arm. Each design was a badge of honor, but also a mark of doom if captured by the enemy. To wear the wrong tattoo in the wrong yard was to invite a death sentence. These markings transcended prison walls, spreading into neighborhoods, schools, and streets, turning young men into soldiers long before they ever stepped inside a cell. What made this conflict truly unstoppable was how deeply ideology shaped the men who lived it. For many inmates, joining Nuestra Familia or the Sureños was not a choice. It was survival. The system left them with no middle ground. Once you entered prison, geography decided your fate. If you came from Northern California, you were a Northerner. From the South, you were a Sureño. Neutrality was suicide. The lines were drawn so sharply that even a shared language, Spanish, could not bridge the divide. Each side developed its own slang, hand signs, and cultural expressions, shaping identities that extended far beyond the cell block. Inside this world, education and violence walked hand in hand. Nuestra Familia's members studied their written constitution, the 14 bonds and 12 general rules, memorizing them as if they were scripture. These codes taught them discipline, unity, and moral purpose, even as they justified acts of extreme brutality. To them, every killing was a necessary sacrifice to preserve la causa. The Sureños, on the other hand, followed a simpler doctrine: complete loyalty to la M, the mother organization. Their structure relied less on philosophy and more on reputation. Power was maintained through fear, through acts of dominance that proved their authority beyond question. As years passed, these ideologies became self-sustaining. Older members mentored younger recruits, teaching them the history of the war, the meaning of the numbers, and the importance of colors. It was a legacy passed down through whispers in solitary confinement, through coded letters smuggled out of the yard. A new generation was raised to believe that their side was righteous, that the enemy was evil, and that dying for the cause was an honor. The ideology even shaped how members saw the outside world. For Nuestra Familia, the struggle extended beyond the prison gates. They believed they were fighting for the Chicano community, for the farm workers and families who lived in poverty in the fields of the Central Valley. Their enemies, the Sureños, were seen as corrupted by greed, seduced by the promises of La M and its ties to the drug trade. Meanwhile, the Sureños viewed the Northerners as traitors, rebels who had turned against their own kind. Both saw themselves as protectors, warriors fighting for survival in a world that had already condemned them. And yet, beneath the rhetoric and colors, both groups were bound by the same reality. They were products of the same system. A system that fed their hatred, isolated them by region, and watched as they tore each other apart. By the 1980s, their ideologies had spread like wildfire through California's prisons and into the streets, recruiting young men who barely understood the history but inherited the loyalty. Inside these walls, ideology was not just belief, it was armor. It gave inmates meaning in a world designed to strip them of it. It told them who they were, what they should die for, and who their enemies were. And so the cycle continued. The brotherhoods grew stronger, their colors brighter, their codes unbreakable. Prisons were no longer institutions of punishment. They had become sanctuaries of loyalty, churches of violence, and schools of war. By the early 1970s, California's prisons had turned into silent volcanoes, trembling under the weight of hatred, pride, and unfinished business. Nuestra Familia and the Sureños, born from the same cultural roots but divided by geography and ideology, now stood on opposite sides of a line that could never again be crossed. What began as insults whispered through bars had transformed into an all-out war, one that would soon leave its mark in blood across the walls of Soledad and Folsom, two of the most feared prisons in the United States. The first major clash didn't begin with strategy or grand declarations. It started with something trivial: a stolen pair of shoes. At Soledad Prison, an inmate associated with Nuestra Familia accused a member loyal to La M of taking his shoes during a baseball game. In the outside world, it would have been a minor altercation. But inside those walls, every insult carried the weight of decades of humiliation. Every act of disrespect was a spark waiting to ignite a fire. Within hours, the argument escalated into violence. Shanks, homemade knives crafted from metal scraps, flashed under the sun as blood stained the prison yard. What followed was chaos. Guards fired warning shots, sirens blared, and inmates threw themselves into the fight, not for shoes, but for pride. That day, 3 inmates died, but their deaths marked something far larger than a personal feud. It was the moment when Nuestra Familia and the Sureños declared open war. From that point on, there would be no peace, no negotiation, only retaliation. In Folsom Prison, a place already infamous for housing some of California's most violent offenders, the ripple effect of Soledad spread like a disease. Folsom became the crucible where the ideologies of both gangs were put to the test. Nuestra Familia members, known for their organization, began to coordinate attacks with military precision. They mapped the prison yard, watched the guards' movements, and identified enemies during mealtime, when men were most vulnerable. Each hit was ordered from the top. The generals who communicated through cryptic messages disguised as love letters or Bible verses. The Sureños, backed by the Mexican mafia, responded with equal ferocity. They didn't plan as much, they reacted. For them, violence was instinctual, a matter of survival and dominance. They struck fast, with no warning, using intimidation as their greatest weapon. Inmates who refused to choose sides quickly learned there was no neutrality. You were either red or blue, north or south. Those who hesitated were often the first to die. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in Folsom in 1972. During lunchtime, a Sureño inmate was ambushed by 3 members of Nuestra Familia. What started as a quick stabbing turned into a full-blown riot. Within minutes, hundreds of inmates flooded the yard, screaming war cries in Spanish and English. Prison guards, outnumbered and overwhelmed, fired into the crowd, trying to stop the bloodshed. When the smoke cleared, 9 men lay dead, most of them stabbed dozens of times. The survivors were dragged away, their eyes cold, their hands still stained red. None of them spoke. Inside their minds, they knew this was far from over. The California Department of Corrections tried to contain the violence through segregation. Norteños were sent to one side of the prison, Sureños to another. But segregation only hardened their identities. Isolation gave them time to plan, to write, to indoctrinate. In the silence of solitary confinement, they wrote letters to their brothers in other facilities, describing the battles, glorifying the dead, and preparing the next generation to take their place. These letters, smuggled through guards, visitors, or corrupt staff, became sacred texts, the chronicles of war. As the 1970s turned to the 1980s, both sides began to perfect their methods. Nuestra Familia created a communication network called the Concilio, or Council, through which leaders in different prisons could exchange information and enforce rules. The Sureños, on their part, extended their influence outside the walls, linking with street gangs in Los Angeles, San Diego, and across the border. The prisons became command centers for a war that no longer belonged only to inmates. It had spilled into the streets. What made these early clashes so defining was their symbolism. For Nuestra Familia, every victory was a message that the oppressed North could rise against the tyranny of the South. For the Sureños, every act of violence reaffirmed their loyalty to La M, the mother organization, the power that could not be challenged. Inmates began to wear their scars as medals, proof of their dedication. Some carved the number 14 into their flesh. Others inked the 13 so deeply it bled for days. Tattoos became armor. Every mark told a story of survival, of revenge, of identity. One former guard at Folsom would later recall the fear that hung over the prison like fog. "You could feel it," he said. "You could feel when something was about to happen. The air got heavy. The men stopped talking. They just waited." The guards, despite being armed, knew they were powerless. The war was not theirs to stop. It was older, deeper, born from years of pain, discrimination, and pride that no bullet could erase. By the late 1980s, Folsom and Soledad had become more than prisons. They were battlegrounds of ideology, blood, and control. Nuestra Familia continued to refine its structure, with generals giving orders to foot soldiers across California. They wrote constitutions, developed training routines, and punished betrayal with death. The Sureños, unified by La M, adopted a decentralized but equally ruthless system. Their strength came from fear of their name, fear of their revenge. The blood spilled in Soledad and Folsom was not just the price of rivalry, it was the foundation of an empire built on violence. Both groups learned from those early clashes that prison walls could not contain them. The California correctional system, instead of breaking their spirits, had forged them into disciplined, organized machines. The government thought isolation would weaken them, but it only gave them time to evolve. The first battles turned prisons into training grounds, their hallways into trenches, their cells into war rooms. From that point on, every generation that entered the system inherited the war like a curse. They didn't ask why it began. They only knew that it could never end. For them, Folsom and Soledad were sacred ground, where the first blood was spilled, where loyalty was proven, and where the war between Nuestra Familia and the Sureños became eternal. The echoes of that first riot still haunt the concrete corridors of California's prisons. The faint whispers of men who died for colors, numbers, and names that would outlive them. It was no longer about the stolen shoes, the insults, or even survival. It had become something far more dangerous, a belief that death itself was the ultimate form of loyalty. By the late 1980s, the war between Nuestra Familia and the Sureños had grown beyond the walls that first confined it. What began as a regional prison feud had evolved into a criminal ecosystem, stretching from the cell blocks of California to the barrios of Los Angeles, the vineyards of the Central Valley, and even the mountains of Mexico. The blood spilled in Soledad and Folsom had birthed something far greater, a federation of fear. And in that federation, money and power became the new gods, worshipped through violence, drugs, and alliances that no one in the beginning could have imagined. Nuestra Familia, once defined by discipline and ideology, started to look outward. Inside Pelican Bay and Corcoran State Prison, its generals began to realize that control over prison yards was not enough. If they wanted true dominance, they needed to own the streets, because the streets were where the money flowed. Cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, these were no longer just commodities of survival. They were the currency of empire. Through covert contacts, Nuestra Familia's upper ranks began to build ties with smaller norteño street gangs across Northern California, offering them protection and guidance in exchange for loyalty. Cities like Salinas, San Jose, and Stockton became strongholds. Young men, many of them barely out of high school, were indoctrinated into La Causa, believing they were serving something noble, the defense of the North. In reality, they were soldiers in a growing criminal network run by men who hadn't seen the outside world in decades. Orders came from within prison walls, transmitted through coded letters, visits from relatives, or messages disguised in poetry and Bible verses. Each command carried weight: collect taxes from local dealers, punish traitors, secure drug routes, expand the family's reach. Meanwhile, in the south, the Sureños, under the shadow of La M, were following a similar evolution, but with even broader ambition. The Mexican mafia had long understood the power of transnational alliances. Through their connections in Southern California, they forged ties with Mexican cartels that were beginning to dominate the drug trade in the 1980s and 1990s. The Guadalajara cartel, led by figures like Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, became an early ally, providing supply lines and distribution routes that the Sureños managed on U.S. soil. La M's soldiers, the Sureños, became their enforcers, collecting payments, distributing narcotics, and executing rivals. As cocaine and heroin flooded into the United States, California's prisons turned into command centers for a billion-dollar operation. Nuestra Familia and the Sureños were no longer just gangs. They were corporations of crime, operating under the guise of ideology but driven by greed and control. Each had their own taxation systems. Dealers on the outside paid rent to the gang that controlled their territory. In exchange, they received protection from the law, from rivals, and sometimes even from death itself. Failure to pay meant execution. In this new order, violence became business. Nuestra Familia imposed a military-style discipline on its soldiers, known as the regiment system. Each city had its regiment, run by a commander who reported directly to prison generals. These commanders oversaw everything, from drug sales to weapon trafficking to contract hits. They collected profits and sent a portion back inside to fund the operations. The hierarchy was precise, efficient, and lethal. For the Sureños, loyalty to La M meant total obedience. The Mexican mafia began to charge a tax known as la cuota, a mandatory payment from every Sureño gang operating in Southern California. In return, La M provided status and legitimacy. Through this structure, dozens of independent street gangs, Florencia 13, 18th Street Playboys, Southside Locos, became united under one banner, the Sureños. This unity transformed the South into an empire of fear that stretched from San Diego to East Los Angeles, from Arizona to Nevada, and deep into Mexican territory. By the 1990s, both Nuestra Familia and the Sureños had become powerful enough to influence not just the underworld, but local communities themselves. In Northern California, businesses were extorted, neighborhoods were patrolled, and young men were recruited as early as 13. Their loyalty was no longer to their family or faith, but to a cause they barely understood. Mothers wept as their sons tattooed the number 14 or 13 on their skin, knowing it was a mark that could never be erased, a mark that meant belonging, but also death. At the same time, the prisons themselves transformed into nerve centers of communication. Nuestra Familia's generals, such as Robert Bobby Lopez and Henry Cervantes, orchestrated operations from their cells with the precision of CEOs. They used visitors, corrupt staff, and contraband cell phones to run their empire. Across the state, in other facilities, La M's leaders, names like Joe Pegleg Morgan and Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena, mirrored the same strategy. Each prison became a boardroom, each letter a corporate directive sealed in blood. The alliances with Mexican cartels made everything more dangerous. For Nuestra Familia, contact with traffickers from Michoacán and Sinaloa provided steady drug supply and access to heavy weaponry. For La M and the Sureños, the relationship went deeper. Their soldiers became distribution arms for cartels like Sinaloa and later the Tijuana and Jalisco organizations. The money pouring in was staggering. The line between gang and cartel blurred. Law enforcement, overwhelmed by the scale of operations, called it organized chaos. By the time federal agents realized the full extent of the alliances, it was too late. The war had transcended borders, languages, and ideologies. It was now fueled by greed and sustained by blood. And yet, inside the minds of those leading it, everything still returned to one core belief: identity. Nuestra Familia members continued to preach unity and justice for the oppressed. The Sureños still believed they were defending La M's legacy. The colors, the tattoos, the numbers, they all remained sacred symbols. But behind those symbols, the ideology had rotted. The cause had become commerce. Still, neither side would admit it. Both continued to justify every act as part of an eternal war, each killing framed as loyalty, each shipment of drugs as survival. They didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as soldiers carrying out destiny. The federations of fear, as some investigators would later call them, had become entities of their own, larger than any one leader, unshakable even by death. When a general died, another rose. When one network was dismantled, another emerged. Violence became cyclical, self-sustaining, eternal. What had started decades earlier as a fight for respect inside Soledad and Folsom had now turned into a continental operation, one that stretched from California's prison cells to Mexico's mountains, feeding off the same blood that had once soaked the prison yard concrete. The war had evolved, but its essence remained: power, pride, and vengeance, the same trinity that had birthed Nuestra Familia and the Sureños now ruled their every move. The prisons that once confined them had become their headquarters. The streets that once feared them had become their empire, and the world, watching from the outside, had no idea that the battle lines drawn decades ago in the dirt of Soledad still determined who lived and who died on the streets of California. Behind the thick concrete walls of California's prisons, power wasn't exercised with guns or armies. It was whispered, written, coded, and smuggled. Nuestra Familia and the Sureños, locked in their eternal conflict, learned to rule from isolation. The men who commanded empires from cages had no need for open violence anymore. They could kill or make money with nothing more than a folded piece of paper, a subtle phrase or a code stitched into a letter that looked innocent enough to pass through any inspection. The war had gone underground, invisible but alive, breathing through the corridors of silence. Inside the maximum security units of Pelican Bay, Folsom, and Corcoran, communication became an art form, one that demanded creativity, patience, and absolute secrecy. Nuestra Familia, disciplined and militarized, developed one of the most sophisticated clandestine communication systems in American prison history. Its generals, locked in solitary confinement for up to 23 hours a day, still managed to command hundreds of men across the state. They called these hidden lines of communication kites. A kite was more than a letter. It was a lifeline, written in microscopic handwriting, sometimes on pieces of toilet paper or cigarette wrappers. It carried orders, names, or death sentences. The messages were smuggled in ingenious ways. Some were hidden inside the seams of clothing, others beneath postage stamps, and sometimes, astonishingly, swallowed and retrieved later. Prison staff would find scraps of coded text in library books, behind posters, or rolled inside the handles of mops. Each kite followed a chain, from the general in solitary to a mid-level lieutenant in general population, then passed through a network of trusted soldiers until it reached its final destination outside the walls. Every message had to survive multiple transfers, each one requiring complete trust. A single weak link could expose the entire operation. Nuestra Familia even developed its own lexicon, a language designed to deceive guards and outsiders. Common words were replaced by symbols, Aztec terms, or Spanish slang known only to the initiated. La Mesa referred to the ruling council. El Cuadro was the inner circle. Mandos were commands. When prison authorities intercepted these communications, they often appeared like meaningless poetry. But inside those lines, hidden between metaphors and coded phrases, lay instructions for drug shipments, assassination orders, or disciplinary actions. The ingenuity of this underground bureaucracy turned solitary cells into war rooms. The Sureños, under the command of La M, operated differently but no less effectively. Their system was rooted in fear and loyalty. Orders from La M were considered sacred, palabra de vida, a word of life. Once issued, it had to be carried out, no matter the risk. Communication flowed from a handful of top-tier mafia members to regional representatives known as shot callers. These men controlled entire yards and through them dozens of street gangs. A single coded phrase from an imprisoned mafioso could ignite a chain reaction of violence across multiple cities. La M's messages were famously cryptic. They used numbers, religious references, and subtle variations in handwriting that only insiders could decode. Sometimes a simple drawing, a hand, a halo, a dagger, carried meaning that could determine life or death. In other cases, verbal orders were passed during visiting hours, disguised as casual conversation with family. Mothers, girlfriends, and even children became unknowing couriers of information. One smile, one word, one gesture. Everything had purpose. The most astonishing aspect of these systems was their efficiency. Despite decades of investigations, raids, and crackdowns, law enforcement struggled to dismantle the communication networks completely. Even after the implementation of security housing units, SHUs, designed to isolate high-ranking gang members, the messages kept flowing. The more prison officials tried to suppress communication, the more creative the gangs became. They began using coded language over monitored phone calls, encrypting messages within legal correspondence, or even embedding them in artwork and music lyrics. Nuestra Familia took its bureaucratic precision to extremes. Every regiment operating outside prison was required to submit written reports detailing their finances, drug operations, and disciplinary actions. These reports were smuggled inside through intermediaries, girlfriends, lawyers, or corrupt guards, and reviewed by the council. Inmates who failed to report or violated protocol were marked for removal, a euphemism for execution. Their system functioned like a government: rules, regulations, taxes, and punishments. For the Sureños, the structure was less formal but equally dangerous. LAEM's members, known as cartels, often issued orders that rippled across multiple prisons simultaneously. Their reach extended to jails, juvenile centers, and halfway houses. The mafia's influence was so profound that some inmates who had never met a true member of LAEM still lived by its rules, reciting them like commandments: respect, silence, and loyalty. Those were the Holy Trinity. By the 1990s, both organizations had adapted to a new era. Contraband cell phones began to appear, smuggled in through staff, maintenance workers, or bribed officers. Suddenly, what once took weeks through kites could now happen in seconds. Generals inside Pelican Bay could coordinate murders in Fresno, collect debts in Modesto, or authorize shipments from Mexico with a single call. Prison officials tried to jam signals, but the networks multiplied faster than they could control them. The irony was bitter. The institutions built to contain these men had become their headquarters. Prison walls no longer symbolized isolation. They symbolized command centers. Nuestra Familia's generals sat behind steel doors, issuing directives that affected hundreds of lives. The Sureños, under LAEM's silent authority, ruled their own empire with invisible hands. Guards began to fear the power they couldn't see, the kind that moved quietly, leaving bodies behind but never clues. Occasionally, authorities intercepted a message, a torn scrap of paper, a hidden phone, a visitor's confession. But for every code they cracked, another system was born. The war had evolved beyond shanks and riots. It had become intellectual, a battle of encryption, secrecy, and control. And within that silent war, loyalty was everything. A man could spend 20 years behind bars and still obey the same command structure, waiting for a single phrase that would change everything: green light. Those two words, often delivered in a kite or whispered during a visit, meant death was authorized. Inmates would kill without hesitation, sometimes without even knowing the reason. That was the power of the system. Belief and fear intertwined until they were indistinguishable. To outsiders, it might seem impossible. How could men behind bars control entire cities? But inside that world, information was power, and secrecy was survival. Nuestra Familia and the Sureños had mastered both. Their messages traveled faster than guards could read, their networks deeper than authorities could trace. Every prison transfer, every visit, every coded note was another thread in a web of invisible authority. By the time the new millennium arrived, the war had entered a new phase, no longer fought in open riots, but in coded whispers. The cell blocks were quiet, eerily so. But behind that silence lay an empire humming with strategy, revenge, and profit. The men who once fought with knives now ruled with words, proving that in the world of prison warfare, silence could be deadlier than any weapon. Time changes everything, except the code of blood. For decades, Nuestra Familia and the Sureños have lived by it, ruled by it, and died for it. Inside the walls, men have been bound by oaths so sacred that breaking them meant death. Yet as years passed, as prison doors opened and closed, a new enemy began to threaten both organizations from within: betrayal. The same loyalty that once defined their strength had turned into their greatest weakness. The empires built on unity were now crumbling under the weight of ambition, greed, and mistrust. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Generations changed, but the ideology stayed frozen in time. The original founders, men who had fought in the blood-soaked yards of Soledad and Folsom, began to die one by one. Some were executed by rivals, others by their own brothers. Those who survived grew old behind bars, watching their creations evolve into something unrecognizable. What was once a family became a machine. What was once about respect became about money. Nuestra Familia's new leaders no longer spoke of La Causa with the same conviction. Instead, they counted profits, weighed risks, and made alliances with the same cartels they once swore to fight. The Sureños, guided by Laime, experienced the same decay. As the Mexican mafia expanded, greed infected its ranks. Younger members saw the organization not as a brotherhood but as a business. Power became currency, and betrayal its natural consequence. Informants, once considered the lowest form of life, began to emerge in unexpected places. Men who had once pledged their lives to silence started trading secrets for freedom. They wore wires, leaked letters, and testified in federal courtrooms, their voices trembling as they described the inner workings of the brotherhood they had once died to protect. Law enforcement had waited decades for that moment. Federal task forces, armed with years of surveillance, wiretaps, and decoded messages, began dismantling both organizations from the inside out. In 2001, Operation Black Widow struck Nuestra Familia with surgical precision. Dozens of high-ranking members, including generals and regiment commanders, were arrested. The government's strategy was clear: divide and conquer. They offered deals, shorter sentences, and witness protection to anyone willing to betray the family. It worked. Some of the most feared men in California, killers, strategists, architects of the cause, took the stand and pointed fingers at their own. Their testimonies were devastating, not only for the organization, but for the myth itself. The sacred idea of loyalty, once the backbone of the familia, had been shattered. La Eme and the Sureños suffered their own waves of betrayal. Operation Carnalismo, Operation Emetac, Operation Dirty Third. Each brought new arrests and new revelations. High-ranking mafiosos who once controlled entire regions were exposed as orchestrating murders, drug routes, and extortion networks from behind bars. Some were caught ordering hits over smuggled phones. Others were betrayed by their own protégés, eager to rise in rank. The cycle of power had turned cannibalistic, each generation devouring the last. Inside prison, paranoia replaced trust. Every new face was a potential informant, every conversation a possible recording. Nuestra Familia began purging its ranks, killing suspected traitors with surgical ruthlessness. The Sureños did the same, following Laime's doctrine: better 1,000 dead than one snitch alive. The prisons turned into silent graveyards of the faithful and the fallen alike. Yet despite the betrayals, the war endured. For every traitor executed, another recruit took his place, young, angry, and eager to prove his worth through blood. By the 2010s, both organizations had evolved once again. The war between Nuestra Familia and the Sureños was no longer confined to California. It had spread to Texas, Nevada, Arizona, and even the Midwest. Street gangs wearing the numbers 13 and 14 fought in neighborhoods thousands of miles away from the original battlefields. The ideology had become viral. Simplified, distorted, and weaponized by generations, that no longer remembered where it came from. The lines between the Sureños, and the cartels blurred even further. Money and survival overshadowed loyalty and purpose. Inside Pelican Bay, some of the old generals began to question everything. Years in isolation had eroded their faith. Letters smuggled from their cells revealed doubt. Doubt in the cause, doubt in the men who led it, and doubt in themselves. Some even attempted to negotiate peace. Meetings between Nuestra Familia and Sureño representatives were quietly arranged, often through intermediaries in lower-level facilities. They talked about ending the decades-long bloodshed, about uniting against the real enemy, the system that had caged them all. But those attempts never lasted. The machine was too big, too addicted to violence to stop. Every time a truce was declared, someone broke it. Every time peace was attempted, blood followed. For many inmates, especially the younger ones, the war had lost all meaning. They didn't know the names of the original founders or the story behind the colors they wore. They joined not for ideology but for protection, for identity in a place that stripped men of their names. Inside, the gang still promised belonging, family, and power. But those promises came at the same price as always: your soul. The oaths still existed. Words recited in dimly lit cells, spoken over improvised rituals, sealed in blood. I will never betray the family. I will never speak of our ways. I will never refuse an order. Yet everyone knew the truth. Those oaths were as fragile as the men who made them. Some broke them for money, some for survival, some out of exhaustion. Outside the walls, families continued to live with the consequences. Mothers buried sons, wives raised children alone, and communities remained haunted by colors that symbolized more than just territory. They symbolized history, trauma, and a war that refused to end. The prisons remained full, the gangs kept growing, and new leaders rose from the ashes of the old. Today, the story of Nuestra Familia and the Sureños is not just one of rivalry. It is a mirror of human nature. It shows how loyalty can become a prison, how ideals can turn to poison, and how the search for identity can lead men to destroy everything, including themselves. The names may change, the faces may fade, but the code endures. It is written into the walls, tattooed into skin, whispered through generations: respect, loyalty, vengeance. Some call it destiny. Others call it damnation. Either way, the war never ended. It simply changed form, from knives to words, from riots to silence, from brotherhood to betrayal. Inside the cells of Pelican Bay, behind the graffiti of East LA, and in the small towns of Northern California, the echoes remain, the eternal rhythm of a war that was born in the dark and will likely die.